Life Stories presents another gripping tale of betrayal, justice, and redemption. Imagine dedicating your life to love and family, only to be betrayed by the very people you trusted most. This is the story of Emily Carter, a devoted nurse whose sister and husband shattered her world. But fate had other plans. Secrets would be exposed, and justice would be served in the most unexpected way. How did Emily find the strength to rebuild her life? What shocking truth did her father reveal? Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's powerful story. The footsteps echoing through the hospital corridor were quicker than usual. My pulse, too, had picked up an uneasy rhythm, mirroring the growing tension in my chest. I had carried this unsettled feeling ever since receiving that phone call from my father. Emily, we need to have a family meeting tomorrow. Vanessa will be there too. His voice was calm, yet the weight of those words settled over me like a heavy cloak. The mention of my sister's name for the first time in 3 years sent a sharp, familiar ache through my body. I stared at the message on my phone screen as I sat in the break room, trying to control the storm of emotions rising within me. A gentle voice broke me from my thoughts. Miss Carter, you look lovely today. I glanced up to see an elderly patient smiling at me from the nurse's station. His face was lined with years of stories, his voice carrying a warmth that reminded me of the simple kindness in this world. I forced a smile and tucked a strand of my brown hair behind my ear. Thank you. Take care, I replied softly, my voice steadier than I felt inside. I had spent 7 years working as a nurse, and over time, I had mastered the art of composure. My uniform was simple, my makeup subtle, my hair always neatly tied back. Patients found comfort in my presence. I was someone who listened, someone who cared. Yet today, beneath my usually composed exterior, a shadow lurked. Outside the hospital windows, the autumn foliage of Boston painted the world in shades of amber and gold. The sight carried me back to this very season 3 years ago, back when my world had started to unravel. Vanessa had always been my opposite, tall, striking, with flowing blonde hair and an unmistakable presence. She had an effortless charm, the kind that drew people in before they even realized it. As a high-end real estate agent, she surrounded herself with luxury, designer brands, lavish parties, and curated social media posts showcasing her extravagant life. And then there was Ryan. Even now, just thinking of his name sent a jolt of pain through me. He had once been the man I trusted, the man I loved, a rising star in the cardiology department. Ryan was admired by everyone at Massachusetts General Hospital. With his sharp features, confident demeanor, and tailored suits, he exuded success. To the world, we had seemed like the perfect couple, a young, ambitious doctor and a kind-hearted nurse. But beneath his charm lay something much colder, something I had been too blind to see. I first met Ryan in the hospital cafeteria 5 years ago. I had been balancing a tray during the chaotic lunch hour when he approached with an easy smile. Is this seat taken? That was how it began, harmless conversations during breaks. Coincidental encounters that slowly became intentional. Before I knew it, I had fallen. His first date invitation had been a casual "how about dinner," yet the restaurant he chose was anything but simple. A candlelit table, a coursed meal, soft jazz playing in the background. It was the kind of setting designed to make someone feel special. And it worked. Our relationship had blossomed effortlessly. Weekends were spent walking along the Charles River, visiting art galleries, exploring Boston's hidden cafes. He made me feel cherished, safe. I still remember the moment he proposed outside a restaurant near Harvard Square, under a canopy of rustling autumn leaves. I've been waiting for someone as sincere as you, he had said as he slipped the ring onto my trembling finger. The wedding was beautiful, held in a small church surrounded by those who mattered most. My mother had cried as she watched me walk down the aisle, while my father's proud gaze followed my every step. Vanessa stood beside me as my maid of honor, her smile reserved, her presence elegant. Looking back now, perhaps there had already been something calculating in her expression. The first year of marriage had been idyllic, almost like something out of a storybook. I woke early to prepare his lunch. We enjoyed Sunday brunch together. And we even took a trip to Cape Cod where we lay under a blanket of stars, whispering about our future. But happiness, I learned, can be deceiving. The changes were subtle at first. Ryan started coming home later, always with the excuse of an urgent surgery. Then came the complaints, small remarks about how he missed dining at upscale restaurants, about how my cooking, though good, lacked a certain refinement. I wish we could eat at the places Vanessa does, he had sighed one evening, barely touching the meal I had prepared. The comparisons to my sister became more frequent. Her taste was better. Her lifestyle was more sophisticated. It was Vanessa who understood him, not me, as I struggled to juggle my demanding job with taking care of my mother, who was battling severe rheumatoid arthritis. Ryan's presence in our home faded. Love became obligation, and conversations turned into criticisms. "Why don't you just leave the caregiving to a facility?" he had asked coldly one night. But I couldn't. My mother needed me. And so, I carried on. I worked long shifts at the hospital, only to return home to a husband who barely acknowledged my existence. I ignored the warning signs, convinced that if I just tried harder, things would return to how they once were. Then, one night, everything fell apart. I had just finished an exhausting shift and was walking to my car in the hospital parking lot when I saw them. A luxury car parked under the dim glow of the streetlights. Two familiar silhouettes inside. Vanessa's laughter rang out, sharp and cruel. "Oh my. Did we get caught?" Ryan didn't even look ashamed. He simply leaned back against the leather seat. His voice calm, detached. "Well, it's over. Let's get divorced." And just like that, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had endured, meant nothing. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain. The divorce was quick, brutal. Ryan demanded a large alimony settlement, while Vanessa spread lies about me to our family, painting herself as the victim. Their relationship, once a secret, was now paraded openly, their pictures appearing on social media, lavish dinners, vacations in Europe, expensive new cars. "Did you really not know?" Vanessa had sneered in our last conversation. Everyone else noticed. "A plain woman like you could never satisfy Ryan." The words cut deeper than I'd ever admit. And then, as if my world had not shattered enough, my mother passed away. I was with her in her final moments, holding her frail hand as she whispered a quiet, almost apologetic, "I'm sorry." Vanessa never came to the funeral. And so, I left. I packed what little I had and moved into a small apartment near the hospital, where no memories of Ryan or Vanessa lingered. 3 years had passed since that night in the parking lot. The wedding ring was long gone, replaced by my mother's keepsake ring, a silent reminder of the love that remained. Now, as I sat in the hospital break room, staring at my father's message, a bitter question echoed in my mind. Why, after all this time, was Vanessa coming back? The taxi moved steadily through the familiar streets of Boston, the evening sky painted in deep shades of crimson and gold. As I stared out the window, my mind wandered back to the last time I had stepped foot in my family home. It had been the day after my mother's funeral, a day I had walked away, vowing never to return. And yet, here I was, heading back to face the very people who had shattered my world. The Victorian-style house stood as grand as ever, its white-trimmed windows glowing warmly against the encroaching night. The rose bushes in the garden, my mother's pride and joy, had been neatly trimmed for the winter. For a brief moment, a flicker of nostalgia softened the tension in my chest. But then I remembered why I was here. I stepped out of the cab, my boots crunching against the gravel. My hands felt clammy as I rang the doorbell, my heartbeat a steady drum of anticipation. The door opened, and there stood my father, Thomas Carter. His salt and pepper hair was slightly thinner. His features a little more lined. But his gaze was just as steady as I remembered. "I'm glad you could make it," he said. His voice warm but firm. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The house smelled the same, faintly, of coffee and old books, with the softest trace of my mother's lavender perfume still clinging to the furniture. Family photos lined the walls, frozen in time, reminders of a past that no longer felt like my own. But something was different. The living room, once a place of warmth and conversation, now carried a heavy stillness. My father's study door was slightly ajar, and inside, I could see stacks of neatly arranged documents, files open on his desk, a computer screen flickering with what looked like security footage. A shiver ran down my spine. Before I could ask anything, the sound of heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed through the hallway. And then, there they were. Vanessa stepped into the living room with the same air of confidence she had always carried. She was draped in an elegant coat, her blonde hair styled to perfection, her designer handbag slung effortlessly over her arm. She looked every bit the successful, polished woman she had crafted herself to be. Ryan followed closely behind, his tailored suit impeccable, his sharp gaze scanning the room as if assessing his territory. He looked bored, indifferent, as though this was nothing more than an inconvenient meeting on his otherwise busy schedule. "Still single," Vanessa's smirk said as she looked me up and down. I felt my fingers curl into fists at my sides, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I sat down in the single chair across from the couch where they had settled in, their body language exuding ownership of a home that was never truly theirs. My father, standing near his desk, cleared his throat. "I've consulted with lawyers about the inheritance," Vanessa began smoothly, crossing her legs. "Ryan and I have been thinking about the future, and we want to ensure everything is handled properly." My stomach twisted. So that was it. That was why she was here. "Yes," Ryan added, his voice calm and measured. "We're happy to help manage the estate. With my background in finance and Vanessa's expertise in real estate, we can ensure everything is allocated correctly." My father simply looked at them. Then, slowly, he walked to his desk and pulled out a thick envelope, sealed with an official notary stamp. "Perfect timing," he said, his voice quiet yet resolute. "I have something important to discuss." I saw it then, the slightest flicker of unease in Ryan's otherwise composed expression. The way Vanessa's smirk faltered for just a second. My father continued, his words steady and unyielding. "I have terminal pancreatic cancer." The room fell silent. 3 months. That was all he had left. I felt my breath hitch, a painful lump forming in my throat. I had known, he had told me weeks ago, but hearing it again, in this moment, made it all the more real. Across from me, Vanessa and Ryan's reaction was drastically different. Vanessa stiffened, her perfect posture faltering, her lips parting in silent shock. Ryan's eyes narrowed, his doctor's mind instantly grasping the gravity of the situation. "Dad, we'll take care of you," Vanessa rushed to say, her voice smooth, but her fingers trembled slightly as she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Yes, I can provide the best treatment," Ryan added quickly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had built a reputation on saving lives. But my father simply raised a hand, cutting them off. "That won't be necessary." He walked back to his desk, opened the envelope, and carefully pulled out a stack of documents. The room's air shifted, heavy with something unspoken. "I want you to see this." Vanessa leaned forward, her eyes scanning the papers. A beat of silence passed, and then, her face paled. Her voice cracked. "These are records of your mother's care expenses," my father said, his voice calm. "Payments you embezzled." Vanessa. "False medical documents." Ryan. One by one, he laid out the evidence, hospital security footage, Unpaid medical bills. Financial records showing the money that had been meant for our mother's care instead funding extravagant purchases. Trips. Luxury cars. Ryan's hands clenched against his knees. This is ridiculous, Vanessa muttered. But her voice lacked its usual confidence. My father turned the computer screen toward them. I also have records from the day your mother passed away. The screen flickered, showing a hospital security camera feed. The timestamp was clear. The footage showed their locations that night, nowhere near the hospital. Nowhere near our dying mother. Instead, they had been at an expensive restaurant, drinking champagne, laughing. You left your mother to die, my father said. His voice quiet but cutting. The weight of the words crashed over the room like a tidal wave. Vanessa's breath came in short gasps, her perfectly painted lips trembling. Ryan's jaw tightened, his composed mask cracking ever so slightly. The truth was laid bare. And for the first time, Vanessa had nothing to say. The room had fallen into an unbearable silence. The weight of my father's words pressing down on all of us like an unseen force. I could see Vanessa's breathing quicken, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of her designer handbag as though it could tether her to the illusion of control. Ryan, ever the composed doctor, was not so composed now. His posture was rigid, his knuckles white as he clenched his hands together. They knew they had been caught. My father sat down slowly, placing the remaining documents on the coffee table between us. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable. Despite the grief and the knowledge of his limited time, he remained a man of precision, a surgeon to the end. I've spent the last 3 years gathering this evidence, he said. His voice steady. Hospital security footage. Unpaid notices from the care facility. Copies of your mother's diary. Text messages. Social media posts. Vanessa let out a sharp, nervous laugh. Dad, you're seriously going through my old messages? This is absurd. My father's gaze didn't waver. Do you deny it? She opened her mouth, then shut it again. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. Look, I don't know what you're implying. I think I've made it quite clear what I'm implying, my father interrupted smoothly, his voice eerily calm. He gestured to the files. You both stole from your dying mother. Lied to your family. You left her alone in her final moments. All while living off the money meant for her care. And when Emily stepped up to do the job you refused, you ridiculed her for it. I saw Vanessa swallow hard. That's not. It's not what? My father's voice was like steel now. Not what it looks like. I have proof. Everything you did. Every dollar you spent on yourselves. Every minute you should have been by your mother's side but instead chose to be somewhere else. Vanessa's hands trembled as she glanced toward Ryan, who was visibly tense. They were trapped. And they knew it. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt too thick, charged with unspoken words, old wounds, and the unmistakable weight of consequence. Then, my father exhaled, closing the final folder in front of him. I called you both here because I have one last thing to share. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out another envelope, this one thicker than the first. The moment he placed it on the table, something in Vanessa's expression shifted. Her eyes darted to it, and I saw the unmistakable flicker of greed. This is my will, my father announced. A beat of silence. Vanessa straightened, smoothing down her coat as if preparing herself for a victorious moment. Ryan remained still, but his gaze was sharp, assessing. My father didn't make them wait. He unfolded the document and began to read. All assets will be inherited by Emily. The words seemed to hang in the air, stretching time itself. Vanessa's face drained of color. What? Ryan inhaled sharply, sitting up straighter. You can't be serious. I'm very serious, my father said, closing the document with finality. The house. The savings. Everything, it all goes to Emily. Vanessa shot to her feet, her composure finally shattering. That's illegal. We have inheritance rights. My father's expression didn't change. You think you have such rights? His voice was colder now. Sharper. After what you've done? Ryan's voice was controlled. But I could hear the barely contained frustration beneath it. This isn't how the law works. Thomas. We can contest this. My father nodded. You could. He paused. Then added. But all of this evidence has already been submitted to my lawyer. And the authorities. Should I choose to escalate the matter? The threat was unmistakable. I watched as Ryan's jaw tightened. Calculations flickering behind his eyes. His career, his reputation, everything he had built for himself, was now hanging by a thread. He knew it. Vanessa knew it. A heavy silence filled the room. Then my father spoke again. This time with more softness. I'm not asking for revenge, he said. His voice quieter. I just want accountability. You stole from your mother. And you let her die alone. The least you can do now is take responsibility. Vanessa's hands curled into fists. This isn't fair. No, I said. Finally speaking. My voice clear and unwavering. What you did to Mom wasn't fair. She turned to me then. Her eyes burning with something between fury and desperation. You've always thought you were better than me. I shook my head. No. Vanessa. I just loved her. Her lips parted. But she said nothing. The house felt colder now. Heavier. The truth was out. And there was no taking it back. My father stood. Slowly. His movements just a little heavier than before. There are conditions, he added. You will return every cent you stole. You will apologize at your mother's grave. And the funds I had prepared for my treatment, he paused. His gaze locking onto Vanessa's, will all be donated. Vanessa took a shaky step back. You can't. I can. Ryan exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. The air had shifted again. They were losing. And they knew it. My father turned to me. His expression gentler now. Emily. I want you to live a life free from the weight of what they've done. You deserve that. A lump formed in my throat. But I nodded. And just like that. It was over. My father's will was final. The inheritance was mine. And Vanessa and Ryan had lost everything. A year had passed since that fateful night. My father was gone. But his final months had been filled with love. Quiet conversations. And moments of peace that I would carry with me forever. I had honored his wishes. Rebuilding my life. Finding solace in the home he left behind. The roses in my mother's garden bloomed once again. Their fragrance filling the spring air. Vanessa and Ryan? Their glamorous world had crumbled. Stripped of their wealth and reputation. They turned on each other. Blaming. Fighting. And eventually separating. The perfect facade they had built was nothing more than dust. As I stood in the garden, sunlight warming my skin, I whispered a quiet thank you to my parents. I had found my strength. My peace. Life moves forward. And so do I. Subscribe to Life Stories for more incredible true stories.